We are beginning the book of Deuteronomy this week, and by the way, we are finally realigned in our Torah readings again, meaning Central and Israel and every other synagogue in the world are finally on the same page again. Phew. Now, this new book, however, doesn't really give us new stories. Deuteronomy literally comes from the Greek meaning copy or repetition of the law, because it merely retells the story of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness with one very important difference. This time, instead of a narrative told in the third person like the previous 4 books in the Torah, Deuteronomy is narrated almost entirely in the first person by Moses. And something significant happens in his retelling. Moses changes the stories. Take, for example, the infamous 12 Spies story, the one I spoke of 2 weeks ago, which is cited as the reason that the Israelites have to wander for 40 years in the desert. When Moses retells that story here in Devarim, he blames the Israelites for insisting that he had to send out spies. "You made me do it," he says angrily. When in reality, it says very clearly in the book of Numbers that sending out scouts was God's idea, God's command. Moses also blames the Israelites for pushing him into having to share judicial leadership with other tribal elders, when in fact it was actually first suggested by his brother-in-law, Jethro, his father-in-law, Jethro, and it was a welcome reprieve from the burden that Moses felt of having to adjudicate their every minor and major issue. So why is Moses changing the story here? I don't think he's trying to create fake news. Rather, I want to share an idea that the scholar Ellen Frankel proposes, that Moses is showing a classic case of the psychological process called countertransference, whereby a therapist projects onto his patients certain conflicts that are still unresolved from his own life. So let's put Moses on the couch for a minute. He's near the end of his life. He's been told he is not going to fulfill his life's mission of getting into the promised land. He's speaking to a brand new generation of Israelites because the old ones had to die off. And these young whippersnappers don't remember what he did for them back in Egypt. And we could go all the way back to talk about the fact that Moses' mom was forced to abandon him in the Nile. Doesn't it always seem to go back to mommy issues? The bottom line is, what we are seeing in Deuteronomy, now that we're in the first person from Moses' eyes, is Moses' very human shortcoming of countertransference. He cannot help but retell the story through the filter of his own unresolved conflicts, unfulfilled dreams, and the impending transfer of power. So often, the way that any of us will view an issue or a conflict is often as much a reflection in the mirror as it is a reflection of reality. Now, I think about that upon my return from a most meaningful visit to Israel in July. I had the gift of learning as part of a pluralistic cohort of rabbis at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where I get to study from about 8:30 a.m. to 9 p.m. every day. Torah lishma, as we say, learning for its own sake. It is one of the most spectacular, delicious, wonderful things, and I am so grateful to this congregation for the opportunity. One of the most memorable speakers in my time this last summer was Mati Friedman, formerly a reporter for the AP and now an independent journalist and author of several books, most recently, Who by Fire?, a story of Leonard Cohen's unlikely musical tour with the IDF during the Yom Kippur War. I read it this spring and highly recommend it. Mati helped me understand that much of the challenge for American Jews understanding the true Israel is our own propensity for countertransference, even though he didn't use that word. For example, in the early decades of Israel's existence, we wanted to discard the sallow yeshiva bucher image. We wanted to connect with a romantic new Israeli, the hunky pioneer, working the land, showing strength after our devastating experience of the Holocaust. All of this is probably epitomized best by the popular book and movie Exodus, in which that new Jew was played by Paul Newman, not a Jew. As Mati said, Israel doesn't conform to our stories, and it never did. It's not like if we could rewind to 1952, we could find Ari ben Canaan. There never was an Ari ben Canaan. That was an American fantasy, he said. It was a good-looking fantasy. He noted that the ways that diaspora Jews want to relate to Israel as a story about he noted the ways that diaspora Jews want to relate to Israel as a story about ourselves, an extension of our own concerns, like the way rabbis, like me, will bemoan the lack of an American-style religious pluralism in Israel. But this can get in the way of actually understanding what is happening there, because our denominational labels don't fit neatly onto theirs. This is why I was so confused when I met a group of new Israeli leaders who call themselves Hiloni rabbis or secular rabbis. Secular rabbis, isn't that an oxymoron? No. I said, why don't you just call yourselves Reform rabbis? Oh, no, they said. We're not Reform. Reform, they thought, was an American import. And they were creating something new and uniquely Israeli. Once I stopped seeing this through the lens of my own desire for Reform Judaism to thrive in Israel, and I understood it for what it was, I could see that something amazing is happening there. Mati pointed out the propensity for Americans, not just Jews, to project our own racial issues on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He wrote, while following the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, which seemed just and necessary, I saw a sign that read, "From Ferguson to Palestine." This sentiment was even uttered by people who are in Congress in America. Mati continued, the occupation of the West Bank is supported by many Israelis mainly because they have rational fears of rockets and suicide bombings, tactics that weren't quite the ones endorsed by the American Civil Rights Movement. All of this is to say that although Israel, like America, is deeply messed up, it's messed up in completely different ways, he said. In the last few years, I've seen language calling Israel a white colonialist settler movement, which is an irresponsible misrepresentation of our historic connection and presence in the land and how statehood began in that country. It also doesn't reflect the reality of a country with a majority population who began as refugees from Arab, African, and Asian countries. And just try asking a Yemenite Israeli if he is a Jew of color. Blank stares. It's an American political category that just doesn't compute. So reading this Torah portion after my most recent visit to Israel reminded me that this countertransference thing, it's age-old human behavior, even if they didn't call it that in Moses' time. I think we all have to put ourselves on the couch and examine why we are telling the stories that we tell. We must try to understand Israel and, frankly, everyone we meet on their own terms, and fight the impulse to see their stories as a reflection of what is just still unresolved or unfulfilled in our own lives. If we can learn to do this, we can discover some very inspiring things. And it is our only true shot of ever really knowing each other.